Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So there are a lot of options when it comes to different firmwares or operating systems you can use in the RG351P, and it's getting a little confusing out there. So I wanted to spend today talking about my RG351P firmware comparison in all the different options you have available to you. Now bear in mind that these firmwares could change at any time because they get updated very frequently, and so because of that I don't really want to focus on individual features, but more about the feel and the philosophy behind each of these firmwares. So let's dig into that. So every RG351P is loaded up with Emulec. Now this is a firmware that's been around for a couple years now, and it's not just for handheld devices, it also works on Android boxes and things like that. Now one of Emulec's stipulations is that they don't want it added to any commercial device. They don't want it sold on any handheld device. So Anbernic did that anyway, and so because of that, they're not getting any support from the Emulec team at this point, and so I refer to this as a modified version of Emulec, but this is what you actually get on your device. So a couple months after the RG351P was first released, the first custom firmware came out, and it's called 351Elec. And I made a video about this, but basically it is also a fork of Emulec, just like the modified version that ships with your device, but it has a lot of neat features and it has its own development team, so they're an independent fork at this point of Emulec. Now a few days later, another operating system was released. This one is called ArkOS, and I also made a video about this one, but it's basically based off of Ubuntu, which is a Linux distribution, and it has a lot of nice powerful features to it, and we'll get into that here in a minute. And finally, Batocera released a version of their own firmware, which works on the RG351P, so we'll take a look at that one as well. So before we dig into individual firmwares, let's talk about what they all have in common. For starters, they all use a front end that's called Emulation Station. So when you're navigating between your games and you're picking your systems and everything else like that, that's all through the Emulation Station interface. Additionally, you can actually press start and go into the main menu settings, and this is also within Emulation Station. In a nutshell, Emulation Station is what you use for your main user interface, and that's what you use for your navigation and your overall settings. But if you've ever opened up a game and then tried to load a menu, you find a completely different interface, and that's because this one is called RetroArch. Now technically this is also a front end, but it kind of works as a back end because it works underneath the layer of Emulation Station, and this is what for the most part will load all of your emulators, which they call cores. So I would think of RetroArch as basically my emulator backend. For the most part, most of your emulators run through RetroArch, and it also allows you to dive into more specific settings on your device that often you cannot find in Emulation Station. Now the last thing I want to bring up before we get into firmwares are SD cards. Now your device will actually ship with its own 64GB SD card, but it's generic and often prone to failure. So because of this, I suggest you get a new SD card from a reputable brand such as Samsung or SanDisk. 128 gigs will probably be enough for most users, but if you're going to use a lot of disk-based games, for example PSP, PlayStation 1, or Dreamcast, you might want to splurge on a 256GB card because that'll allow you to store even more games. Additionally, I suggest that you get an SD card reader, which will allow you to plug it directly into your computer and access your SD card from there. And these are only about $10, and I'll leave a link to everything in my written guide, which is linked below the video here. Alright, so let's start talking firmware here. We're going to start with 351Elec. Now, like I mentioned before, this was forked from Emulec 3.9. It's 100% open source and independent of Emulec, and it uses a 64-bit user space, although it also can use 32-bit apps as needed, which allows you to basically have more freedom and flexibility to get the best emulators possible. One of my favorite things about this firmware is that it has optimized default settings. So basically when you turn on an NES game, it looks the way an NES game is supposed to look, and it has all of those graphical settings already pre-configured for you. So that's super handy. On top of that, they've slowly been moving all of the RetroArch configurations over into the Emulation Station menu, which basically means that you will be able to control almost everything without having to learn how RetroArch works, which is pretty cool. And another really great thing about this firmware is that it has significant community support. And what I mean by that is they have a Discord server, and they're very active on there, so you can actually go in there and you can test the nightly versions of these firmwares, so you can always check out what's happening on the horizon, and you can provide feedback and get answers right there in Discord, which is really helpful. And on top of that, they also do user surveys, which allows you to kind of vote for the features you want to see next, which is really kind of a neat option. So now let me show you how to install 351Elec. So to start, you're going to want to go to the written guide that I have linked below, and that'll have links to all of these different operating systems. So we'll start by going to the 351 Elect section, and then just click on the link, and then go to their GitHub page. And there you're going to want to download the SD card image. And each of these GitHub pages have their own installation instructions, and I don't want to walk you through all of that for every single one, so just follow the instructions you have available there. As you can see, this one was updated just a few hours ago as of making this video, and all you have to do is just download the software image. And even though technically you can flash a zipped file, I recommend that you unzip it first, because a lot of people find that they have errors and issues and stuff when they try to flash a zipped file. So it's just easiest thing to do is just unzip it and drag it over to your desktop. Okay, so once you have it unzipped, we're going to flash it onto an SD card. We're going to use an app called Win32 Disk Imager or Apple Pie Baker for macOS, which I'll leave linked below. All you have to do here is just confirm you have your SD card in the correct drive, and then pick the image, and then select the Write button. Okay, and so once it's done flashing, all you have to do is eject the SD card and then plug it into your RG351P to finish the process. So let's do that now. So you can see here I have a 128 gig Samsung SD card. I'm just going to pop it in and then turn the device on. And what it's going to do here is it's going to resize the file partition within the SD card to give you the maximum allowable space on the SD card itself. After it's done doing that, it's going to reboot, and then you're going to be in. Now, because it doesn't have any games or anything loaded up on it, it's going to be very bare bones. Now, at this point, you basically have two options. You can plug in a Wi-Fi dongle and then connect to your local internet, and then you can transfer files wirelessly. And your second option is to basically just eject the SD card and plug it into your computer and transfer files over that way. We're going to do the second one, so I'm going to take this one out and I'm going to plug it into my PC. Okay, so back on my computer, I'm going to plug in my SD card, and you can see two windows pop up. The first one is called 351 Elect, and this is actually all of your system files. So when you update this firmware, all you're really going to do is you're going to swap out some of these 351 Elect files for newer files, and that's how you update the operating system, which is really handy. But the main partition you're going to be working with is called the Games partition. And within this, you're going to find a bunch of different folders. And each of these folders, for the most part, correspond to different systems, so this is where you're going to drag and drop your games. But in addition, there are a couple ones that are unique. So for example, in the BIOS folder, you're going to want to put all your BIOS files. And there's also a folder called BGM, and this allows you to add background music to your emulation station experience. So if you have any favorite MP3s, you could just add them right here and they'll play in the background as you're navigating through your games, which is really kind of neat. Okay, so let's actually add some games. So I'm going to open up the NES folder, and I'm going to take my own NES folder that's full of a bunch of my favorite games, and I'm just going to drag them over. And that's really all you have to do to add games. It's as simple as that. So you just continue to do that for all your systems, and then you can eject the SD card and move them back onto your device. So here we are back on the RG351P, and you can see here there's a Nintendo section now. Now I haven't gone and scraped all the artwork and stuff like that, but you can do all that directly on the device. Just make sure you're connected to your local Wi-Fi in order to do it. Now, like I mentioned before, when you load up a game, it's going to have optimized default settings. So for example, I'm going to start up Contra here on the NES. And you can see here it's in a 4:3 aspect ratio. So let's get into the settings and see what that actually looks like. So you hit L3 and R3 to go into the RetroArch settings, and we're going to back out and go to the video settings. And you can see here under scaling, it's defaulted to 4:3. Additionally, if you go into the video settings, you can see that the RGA scaling is already set for this system, which is a really great thing because that's one of my favorite things to do to get the best and clearest screen for this device. And this is the only firmware that has that set by default, which is very handy. Now, if you wanted to, you can actually go into the emulation station settings in the main menu and then go into the game settings, and you can adjust a bunch of the different options right then and there for every system. So for example, if you wanted to default to 4:3 for all of your systems, or if you wanted to set RGA scaling or even integer scaling, which is very good for handhelds, you can set all of that right then and there. But I would just caution to check out the default settings first because they've done a really good job of getting the right settings for the right system. Now, one of the things you can do on this device is change different emulation station themes. Now, there are 2 that are preloaded on the 351 Elec, but you can also download more if you're connected to the internet. But in general, this is how you're going to change the look and feel of your system itself, is through these different themes. And each of these firmwares have different themes that they use. So I don't want to talk too much about emulator performance because that can change at a moment's notice, but I do want to talk a little bit about a new PSP emulator that's available on all of these systems at this point. Now here you're seeing the original footage from a typical PSP experience. You can see here God of War Chains of Olympus is running at about 17 frames per second, and it's just unplayably slow. And you could do frame skip and other things like that to try to make it better, but this new emulator, which originally came from Batocera, has a new speed hack to it, and I want to show you how that looks. So you go into the settings here, and then you navigate down to this section that says Force Max FPS. So if you turn that on, you're basically limiting the maximum amount of frames per second available on the device. And if you tune that down to say something like 30 or 40, the device is just going to perform that much better. So here I'm going to set it to 30 frames per second, and then I'm also going to turn on frame skipping to 1, and then I'm going to change it to number of frames as opposed to percentage of FPS. And that's it. Don't turn on auto frame skipping and keep it on buffered rendering. Now look at the difference between this exact same theme here. Look at how smoothly it runs. I'll just let this play out for a second. Now it's not perfect. I don't think this game is ever going to play perfectly on this device, but it's sure playing pretty well. You know, there's a little bit of stuttering, but overall this is actually an enjoyable experience to me. And that's really pretty exciting. And it also is a testament to these different firmwares because this was originally a Batocera, and then 351 Elec took it on board, and now ArkOS has it as well. So this is just kind of a matter of time with these open source handhelds, is that they're going to have improved performance, and they're kind of learning best practices from each other, which is really kind of neat. So instead of focusing on individual emulator performance, I wouldn't even worry about that part because it's all going to catch up eventually. Instead, I would recommend that you focus on the user experience and which one fits you the best. Okay, so that's 351 Elec in a nutshell. Let's move on to the next one. So next up is ArkOS. Now this one is actually based on Ubuntu 19.10, which means that it is legitimately an operating system as opposed to a firmware that you would find in 351 Elec. And what that basically means is it has a little bit more freedom when it comes to porting over Linux apps that'll work natively on ArkOS. They just have to basically be recompiled at this point. Now that doesn't mean that every single Linux or Raspberry Pi app is going to work natively on this. What it basically means is that the potential is there within ArkOS. One of my favorite aspects of ArkOS is that it is very online friendly. Once you have it hooked up to the Wi-Fi, you're able to do online updates over the air, just like you would like on your cell phone or something else like that. In addition, you can update your RetroArch cores, which will allow you to update your emulators, which is very handy. And there's also a browser that's available, so you can actually just pull up your browser and FTP into your device via a web browser instead of having to use an FTP client. So overall, it's very friendly when it comes to connecting to the internet. Honestly, once you put this card in the first time, you theoretically would never have to take it out again because you can do everything online at that point. Now, another nice thing about ArkOS is that it has a bunch of themes that are customized for the RG351P screen, and they're already preloaded onto your device, which is very, very handy. Now, ArkOS also has a games partition available for you, so you can plug in your SD card directly into your computer, but instead of having a Win32 file system, it has an exFAT file system, which makes it much more friendly for Mac devices, and in general, it works just a little bit faster as well. And although ArkOS doesn't have its own Discord server, it has a very comprehensive wiki page. So you can actually just go onto that wiki and check it and see all the frequently asked questions and all of the different emulators that work for it, as well as a bunch of instructions. So that's very handy if you just want to kind of find your answers right then and there. And finally, this one's really small, but I love it. You can actually load up your own custom splash screen, which means that when you start up a game, instead of seeing the ArkOS logo or anything else like that, you can just load up anything. You can load up a picture of your cat for all that matters. Whatever makes you happy, you can see it every time you boot up a game, and I find that really fun. So I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about how to install ArkOS because it's the exact same process. All you have to do is go to the written guide that I have linked below, and it'll have links on how to install that. But you basically are just going to download a software image, you're going to flash it to an SD card, and you're going to plug it into your device. Super simple. And just like how it is with 351 Elec, it'll resize the partition for you, and you don't have to do anything else. So here we are with the interface, and you might recognize this because this is the main interface I use in a lot of my videos. So first things first, I want to show you the options section. This is where you're going to set up your Wi-Fi. This is where you do online updates. This is also where you're going to enable remote services so you can FTP into your device. And additionally, there is an advanced section. And within here, you can back up your settings. You can disable your Wi-Fi altogether, or you could even set your CPU clock speed. So if you wanted to overclock, this is how you would do it. To set up your Wi-Fi, you just go into the Wi-Fi section, you select the default Ethernet section, and then you delete that out. And then you hit the R button to tab over to the plus, and then you just pick whatever network you want to use. So once you're connected to the internet, let me show you how to do an update. You just push the update button, and then you read the warning, and then you hit OK, and then you type in OK to verify that you've read the warning, and then there you go, it just starts right up. And to me, this is one of my favorite parts about ArkOS. It's really cool just to be laying in bed and say, you know what, I'm going to update my RG351P, and bam, there you are. Okay, and here we are with the most updated version of ArkOS. Now another thing I want to show you is that there are two different versions of RetroArch. There's a 64-bit version and there's a 32-bit version. And this is really handy because some games play better on the 32-bit version of a RetroArch core and others play better on the 64-bit. So this just gives you the best of both worlds. Now once you're in RetroArch, this also has an online updater tool. So if you go down to Online Updater and then you select Update Installed Cores, this will allow you to go through and update all of the RetroArch cores within there so you have the most recent emulators for your device. Now this is not something you need to do every day, but I would just maybe do it once a week or so and see what other updates you can have for there. So while we're here in RetroArch, let me show you how to change the different themes within RetroArch, which they call menu drivers. You're going to go back to the settings, go to drivers, and then menu drivers, and then pick the one you want. I like the XMB one. And then you back out to the main settings, and you go to configuration, and then you select Save Current Configuration. And that's it. Now you just want to restart RetroArch. And there you go. Now I have this menu driver, which is the XMB menu driver. And this is just the one I prefer, but you can play around with that and see which one you like best. Now going over to the SD card itself, you can see here that it also has a background music folder, so you can add your own background MP3s. And it has its own BIOS folder, so you're going to want to add the BIOS files that way. The easiest way to grab your BIOS files is from the original SD card that came with your device. It also has a BIOS folder, so you can actually just move all of those files over wholesale, and they'll, for the most part, work pretty good. Now additionally, there is actually a Doom folder, which will allow you to run a different version of Doom called LZ Doom, and we'll get into that here in a second. And finally, let me show you this Launch Images folder here. If you go into here, you're going to find a JPEG here called loading.jpg. Now, if you replace this with another image that has the same name, loading.jpg, and it's 480 by 320, when you start up your game, you'll have a different splash screen. So you can see here, I have the best one ever. And it's really kind of cool to kind of put your own stamp on your own device like that. It's really fun. Now, if you remember, on 351 Elec, it has optimized default settings. Now, on ArkOS, we can verify that it doesn't have that same feature. So, for example, we go into the video settings, you can see the aspect ratio defaults to 3:2, or if you go down here, you can see the RGA scaling is off. Now, I like to have it on, so all you have to do is just turn it on at this point, and then back out to the quick menu, and then go down to overrides, and then save core overrides. And that basically means anytime you load up this core or this NES emulator, it's going to come out with RGA scaling, and it works just fine. So it's really not that much work, but it is kind of nice that 351 Elec has this by default, and really in ArkOS you just have to go in and make this setting one time, and then you're good to go. One of my favorite things about ArkOS is that it has its own Doom folder, so you can drop in your Doom WADs or your Doom mods, and for the most part they're just going to play right out of the box. So all you have to do is just pick whichever WAD you want to use. For example, here's the Sigil one, and you just start it right up, and bam, there it is. Now honestly, I haven't been able to get PK3 files to work at this point, so I'm not able to get Brutal Doom working, for example, but I think it's within the realm of possible. I just haven't figured it out myself, and once I do figure it out, I'll be sure to make a guide for everyone. But as it stands, it's really cool to play, for example, Sigil, which up until now I was not able to play on the RG351P, so that's really exciting. So let's take a look at all of the preloaded themes that are available on ArkOS. And there's about 10 or 12 of them right here, and you can see out of the box these are just going to play perfectly, and they've been optimized for the 351P screen. So let's check out the Switch one first. And there you go. It looks kind of like a mini retro Switch. This one's kind of fun. And here's another one that I really like, and it's called Epic Noir. And what I really like about this one is it's very clean cut and kind of professional looking. It has really nice images to it. Okay, so that's ArkOS in a nutshell. Let's move on to Batocera. So like 351LEC, Batocera is a very lightweight Linux distribution, so it's more like a firmware than an operating system. It's also 100% open source, and it's had years of development across several different platforms, to include things like the Odroid Go Advance, Raspberry Pis, even Windows and Mac have their own versions of Batocera, so this one's been around for a while. Now this one has really good emulation for the PSP and Nintendo 64, but like I mentioned before, that can change at a blink of an eye. So for example, just in the time that I've been filming and researching for this firmware guide, the other two firmwares, ArkOS and 351LEC, already have these new emulators installed. So it's super cool that how quickly everything moves like that. Now to be honest, Batocera is not quite optimized for the 351P at this point. For example, the A and B buttons are swapped in the menu and it's really hard to get used to. And on top of that, it has a lot of bugs and I find myself having a lot of crashes with this operating system. And that's just because it hasn't had enough time to kind of get all those bugs out. I should also mention that this does not have its own dedicated games partition on the SD card, so you cannot plug this SD card into your computer and just start loading games. You have to do it all via Wi-Fi FTP, which is significantly slower than using your SD card. And on top of that, this also does not have a sleep mode, so if you tap the power button and put the device to sleep, it does not work. It actually just restarts or turns off the system itself. So these are some of the kinks that Batocera needs to work out before it's a fully fledged firmware in my opinion. So just like with ArkOS, Batocera has the ability to use your own custom splash screen. So for example, you can see here, I used a Retro Game Core one as well. And honestly, I really love that about these different firmwares. To be able to have just a little bit of personalized piece of it is really kind of fun to me. So this is what the default theme looks like. Nothing crazy, it's just very simple and easy to get to. You can see here it has some issues. So for example, the battery percentage is showing 39% when this is a fully charged battery. But since I've already shown you how PSP performance will work when you have everything in tune, let me show you how Nintendo 64 can work as well. So there's a new plugin for the Mupin 64 Plus standalone emulator, and you can see here it runs really well. Now it doesn't have a lot of features involved in it. For example, there is no user interface with this. You basically just have to save everything within game or with save states using hotkeys. But for the most part, it looks really good. Look at how nice the castle looks right there. And it's not perfect. For example, you can see the shadows underneath the characters are kind of like flickering, but for the most part, it runs really solid, it runs nice and fast, and this is by far my favorite Nintendo 64 emulator to date. And just like with the PSP emulator, this one now works in ArkOS, and I think they're working on it for 351LEC as well, so probably by the time I publish this, you're going to be able to play it on all three of these different custom firmwares, which is one of my favorite things about this community, is that everyone shares all of the findings that they have, and all of a sudden everybody's firmware works better, and that's just one of the coolest things about this community. Now you can see here with Ocarina of Time, there is some jittering and flashing on the ground, so that's a little distracting, but it runs really nice and smooth, so you just kind of have to make a decision. Do you want to have that really smooth gameplay with a little bit of flickering, or do you want to try a different emulator? But you can see here with Mario Kart 64, it runs like a dream. I love it. Okay, so now that I've gone through the three different custom firmwares, I want to kind of drill it down and summarize everything. I'm going to start by listing off some of the pros with each of these firmwares, and then the cons, and then I'm going to explain specifically who I think this is the best audience for this specific firmware. So here we go. So let's start with the stock firmware. Now some of the pros include the fact that it's preloaded already with a bunch of games and BIOS, so if you just want to jump into a game, this is a very easy way to do it. Now it uses a very nice EmuLEC interface. Unfortunately, they kind of borrowed it without asking, but it's still there and it works pretty well. This firmware also allows you to plug in USB controllers, whereas ArkOS and 351LEC do not have that ability. So if you really want to try to play two-player games with two different controllers, this is going to be an option for you. And like I said before, really there's no further work required. You don't have to download and install a new firmware onto this device, you can just use the stock one. So now let's talk about cons. Number one, this operating system is actually not optimized for your device. By that I mean you have to actually go in and configure the screen yourself, and I have a guide to that and I'll link that in my written guide, but basically what I'm saying here is that it's not going to work perfectly right out of the box. And like I've mentioned a couple times already, there's kind of an ethical quandary when it comes to this. Number one, it's loaded up with a bunch of games which shouldn't have been there in the first place. And also they borrowed the emulec interface without getting any permission, and so I don't really like that fact. And the honest truth is that Chinese manufacturers like Anbernic are not very transparent when it comes to their updates. So we have no idea when the next update is coming for this emulec modified firmware. At this point, we're just kind of waiting for them to drop a new thing. Whereas with ArkOS and 351elec, you can actually peek into their Discord or GitHub pages and actually see what they're working on right now, which is really, really helpful and transparent. And finally, the stock firmware is limited to 32-bit apps only. Now that doesn't mean a whole lot right now because for the most part, most of the apps works just fine with a 32-bit architecture. But if there ever becomes a time when 64-bit is required, this firmware will not be able to keep up. So who do I think this firmware is best for? I think it's really best for anybody who just wants to buy a device that they can just pick up and start playing games, where you don't want to have to deal with getting a new SD card or downloading new firmware or installing anything like that. This is the best bet for you if you just want to get in there and start playing some games and you're okay with a few compromises here and there. So now let's talk about 351elec. Now some of the pros include the fact that it is a very lean and efficient operating system, and it's optimized with these default settings that work really well right out the box. And also I really like the fact that it has a very powerful emulation station menu. You can go in there and change things like RGA scaling, which is something you can't do in the other firmwares. And finally, it has a very enthusiastic community around it. If you go onto their Discord server, you can find just a bunch of people talking and helping, and it's just a lot of fun to kind of be involved in that community. Now, some of the cons include the fact that the RetroArch hotkeys are not already preloaded. Now, they do this to give you the flexibility to set any hotkey you want to, but I like the fact that ArkOS actually has them all set up for you already. And this one really isn't a dig at 351elec in particular, but I really like the fact that ArkOS has online wireless updates, and the fact that 351elec doesn't have it makes me feel like it's kind of a missed opportunity. One weird thing about 351elec is you have to actually install the Nintendo DS emulator via Wi-Fi, so if you don't have a Wi-Fi connection for your device, you're not able to play any Nintendo DS games until you have that loaded up. And finally, I've mentioned it before, but 351elec uses a FAT32 partition, as opposed to the exFAT partition on the ArkOS. Now this one is a little bit slower than the exFAT partition, but the thing I don't like about FAT32 partitions is that sometimes it won't play well with Windows. So if you're plugging this into Windows all the time, and then you try to plug it into your Linux operating system, sometimes it'll have a hard time writing files. And so for example, I've heard of a lot of people who aren't able to save states or save files after they've been using a FAT32 partition for a while. Now there's an easy fix for it. All you have to do is repair the SD card within Windows, but still it's just an extra hurdle that you don't have to do with ArkOS. Now who do I think 351elec is best for? I think this is the best operating system for people who want an experience of what it should have been like on the stock firmware from the get-go. And I think if you really just want to have a better version of emulec, this is the version for you because it still is very lean and efficient like emulec is, but it has all these nice tweaks that are really specific to the RG351P. So if you like that emulec experience, 351elec is the one for you. Okay, so let's talk about ArkOS. Some of the pros include the fact that it is very online friendly. You can update the firmware itself online, you can update your RetroArch cores. I really like those aspects. And I really like the comprehensive wiki page that it has set up on their GitHub page, because you can just go there and then look at the frequently asked questions, and for the most part, you'll find every answer you're looking for right then and there. I really think they hit a home run when it comes to the customized themes, because you can just go into your UI settings and change your themes without having to install or download new ones. You just go and you just select it, and then all of a sudden it's there, and it's been customized for the screen already, which is really handy. And finally, because this is based on Ubuntu 19.10, it has a lot of Linux potential. I think in the coming months, we're going to see a lot more Linux apps and Raspberry Pi apps that are eventually implemented for ArkOS, and I'm really excited about that prospect. Now, some of the cons are the fact that, number one, it requires some familiarity with RetroArch because you need to go into those settings and change like the screen configuration and things like that. Luckily, I have all that in my guides in my YouTube channel, and I'll have it linked in my written guide how to do each of those things. And unfortunately, ArkOS doesn't have its own Discord server. What that basically means is you have to kind of hunt around to find the answers you need, but luckily there is a GitHub's issues page, so you can go on there and ask questions of the developer or request new features, and he responds really quickly, which is very awesome. Now overall, because this is a larger Linux distribution, it has a larger file size. So for example, it takes about 2 gigabytes to download off the internet, and then when you unzip it, it's about 8 gigabytes. So it's significantly bigger than 351 elec, but really that's only an issue when it comes to downloading it initially and then loading it onto your SD card. After that, it doesn't really matter. And finally, they have a smaller development team because it's basically just one person working on this operating system, and they're really good at what they do, but they have limited time. There's only 24 hours in a day. So you basically have to wait for the features to come on board because there's not a whole dedicated team involved in the development like there is with 351 elec or Batocera. Okay, so who do I think ArkOS is for? Number one, I think it's for anyone who wants a self-contained operating system. If you want to just be able to plug in your SD card and then do everything on the device itself, for example, wireless online updates, this is going to be a really good solution for you. And secondly, I think it's also for people who enjoy RetroArch, who are familiar with that format, because a lot of the settings need to be tweaked in RetroArch itself, which isn't really that hard to get used to, but it does take a little bit of a learning curve. So if you already know RetroArch, this is a perfect system for you. Alright, so let's finish off with Batocera. So number one pro is the fact that it actually also has online updates, much like ArkOS. The thing is, it hasn't had an online update yet, so I'm not really sure if it works. I can see it in the menu, but I'm not sure if you can actually do it or not. So like I showed you earlier in this video, Batocera has very good PSP and Nintendo 64 emulation. Now, I also want to caveat with the fact that now the other operating systems have this as well, so it's really kind of neither here nor there at this point. One nice thing about Batocera is it has a lot of available themes for it, and that's because this is available on a lot of different devices, so there's a much bigger audience when it comes to this. That being said, a lot of these themes are not optimized for the small screen on the RG351P, so they're not even worth installing. And finally, there's a large development team involved in Batocera, and I think that's a good thing because the more people you have tackling a problem, that means they're going to find more features and more updates and stuff like that. So in general, I think that's a positive thing. Now moving over to the cons, this is a very buggy firmware. I've had a lot of crashes and things like that I don't experience on the other firmwares. And there is no SD card partition for this firmware, which means you can't plug the SD card into your computer and drag and drop games like you can with the other firmwares. And like I mentioned before, there's no sleep mode, so if you really like the ability to just tap it off real quick and then tap it back on, you don't have that available in Batocera right now. And finally, this is just one of many supported distributions for Batocera, which means that it's available on Raspberry Pi and Windows and Mac and things like that, which to me is an indication of the fact that the 351P version of this firmware may not get a lot of attention because I bet you a lot of the team is focused on Windows emulation and Mac emulation and things like that, which have much bigger audiences. So when it comes down to it, the 351P might get left behind. And finally, who do I think this is best for? Honestly, I think the only people who are really going to get a lot out of this Batocera image are those who already use Batocera, who are very familiar with how it works and they know the ins and outs of it already. And yes, it may have better emulation from time to time, but it's only a matter of time before the other firmwares get on board and they also have that same level of emulation. And we've seen that happen just in this past week with both PSP and Nintendo 64 emulation. So when it comes down to it, I would suggest you check out 351 elec or ArkOS instead of Batocera. Okay, one last plug if I haven't done it enough already, be sure to check out the written guide that I have linked below because I go into more detail about each of these operating systems and really walk you through the process of installing and setting everything up. And you can see here I have a whole Venn diagram set up that you can go and look and see all of the different options that are available and what is available on some firmwares and not on the others. So I recommend you go to my written guide and really kind of digest all of that. Alright everyone, that's really it for this video. This is a much longer video than I thought it would be. I thought it was going to be about 10 minutes tops to walk through all these firmwares, but once I started filming everything and really digging into all the different options you have available, I realized that I had to get into the details and really show you everything that you could do with each of these firmwares. And I hope I pulled that off for you. So I think when it comes down to it, the use of a firmware is really subjective, right? Some people might like certain things more than others. For me personally, I found that I like ArkOS the best because I really like the fact that it's a standalone operating system. I like the fact that I can just jump in there and I can turn it on and I can plug into the Wi-Fi and then update the operating system right then and there from my couch as opposed to having to go onto my computer and drag everything over. And it's just a little thing, but I really love that. I also love the fact that it has a custom splash screen because it allows me to basically add any sort of personalization I want to my own device, which is really a kind of fun feeling. Okay, everyone, I'm going to sign off now. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I really appreciate that you watched all the way through to the end, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.